Hello, everybody. I'm Jack Dennis, and I'm here for the Umpqua Legacy Fly Series. This is number three, and I'd like to introduce you to myself to people who are a little bit younger. I've been in the fly fishing business. I've been fly fishing 70 years. I started when I was 5 years old. You add that together, and it's 75 years old. And I've had an absolutely wonderful life in the world of fly fishing. I tied my first professional flies at 11 years old for Norm Thompson and tied for Dan Bailey and Bud Lilly and Orvis, kind of a bunch of different companies. But my life really changed when I got to meet Randall Kaufman in 1965. We became friends, went on a couple backpacking trips, and started sharing our knowledge of fly tying. And it was 1967 when we met Dennis Black, and that was at the very first Federation of Fly Fishing conclave, which was held in Jackson Hole at the Triangle X Ranch. And we met, and we were tying flies at a little shop in Jackson, and we brought Dennis down there and watched. He watched us tie, and that friendship started. And it actually, before Dennis passed away, we got a chance to go back. He came and visit us, and we got to go back to the shop. Oh gosh, I don't even remember how many years now that was. But we are celebrating 50 years of Umpqua. And Randall and Dennis and I, we weren't very, we could just barely get enough gas money to go anywhere. But we decided we would get together and share our fly tying. And I had started a business in Jackson in 1967. Randall was going to be my first partner. But when they hit 20 below, Randall ran off to Oregon, where his mother had just moved and liked the weather since he was a Southern California boy. But we remained friends, and we got together and did tying sessions. We had a big tying log building, which is now Nora's Steakhouse. But it was, I had this great vision that I could get all these wives and everything interested in tying flies, and we could do it commercially. Dennis was the smartest one. He knew that it had to be done overseas, and he was one of the visionaries that helped make that happen. But we got together and started working on flies. Dennis was a tyer that tied lots of nymphs, and we all tied for Orvis. And we put our Orvis order down, and the flies that they were skilled at, which were the hair flies, I would tie them, and they would tie the nymphs that I wasn't skilled at, and we filled the orders, and we had fly tying contests to see who could tie the fly fastest. Now, we were getting $1.80 a dozen. So, I mean, you had to be pretty fast, 4 dozen an hour if you're going to make any kind of money. And it wasn't too bad, but you could see the handwriting on the wall when you'd see an order for 60 dozen humpies. So one of the things that started out for me is I was real lucky to have a grandfather that took me fishing with with guides out of Moose, Wyoming. You're going to see a little bit about that, where I hung around the Moose tackle shop and learned from the guides how to fly fish. And it was just a wonderful experience. And I got to fish with Joe Humphreys and Charlie Ridenhour. They were both in the Olympics as wrestlers, and they were roommates and great friends. And I was showing them the Humpy dry fly, and they were complaining about they couldn't see it, and how I had to do something to make that Humpy more visible. And that was, of course, adding white wings. And they kind of gave me the idea, and the Royal Humpty became a pattern that I gave the name to. I'm sure somebody tied it before. I'm not real big on people inventing flies. I think you create it. You take a recipe, just like you do in baking, and then you give it a fancy name, and hopefully it catches fish. And of course, that was Dennis's big idea because he wasn't skilled enough to tie all the flies. And he realized that I could tie the hair flies, Randall could tie the nymphs, and eventually into tying other flies. But he recognized everybody had an expertise. So he went out and found tyers like Dave Whitlock and Mike Lawson and bought this I don't know at that day what we call it is here we call it Signature Tyers. But back then, I mean, to be an Umpqua Tyer, that was big medicine. You were considered the pro of the pros. But anyway, our friendship continued. I helped Dennis create the hair flies, and they're still tied to the way the muddler minnows and the irresistibles and the humpies and the Royal Humpies are all tied from the way that I helped him. And I did this as a friendship thing. And I didn't join the signature program till later because I had already had a contract to help develop flies for Dan Bailey. But eventually we got together, and that was, 30 years ago. Realize it's 50 years. That's a long time. So anyway, I'd like to also say this is the 50th year for this book. And you can see on my nose is the Royal Humpty. And it became my first standard pattern. There's hardly a place on earth you can't buy one. And it really made a lot of sense. And I really give Joe Humphreys and Charlie Ridenhour the ideas. And of course, this was also a very favorite fly of Lee Wolf. He says, why couldn't I have thought of that? We had a lot of fun, and we'll be talking about the Periwolf, which is another one that I worked with other people on, and with Lee Wolf, which was a tremendous honor. So anyway, the 50 years ago has gone by way faster than I ever anticipated. And I know that a lot of young people, a lot of them probably don't even know me, but the people who grew up in those 50 years, imagine this book still sells after 50 years because it's basics. And now, of course, you can, we have a YouTube channel, JD's Wide World of Fly Tying and, well, fly fishing and fly tying. And there's so much information out in the Umpqua series of flies. Oh, you guys don't know what it was like before. To go to a book that you couldn't even check out at a library, make drawings. As Mike and Lawson and I would take flies apart to try to learn how to tie them and struggle over and over again until we got it right. So anyway, we're going to start with the Royal Humpty, and it's still a great pattern, especially in a size 18. It's a great flying ant pattern. I've got some wonderful stories that go back to the different flies, and I'll try to get into them to tell you how some of these were created. So the Royal Humpty, let's go to that. And this, by the way, is from our DVDs. What you're seeing is from our DVDs.
The Royal Humpy is really a marriage between the Humpy and the Royal Wolf. But what you can do is change the colors of the hackle and the body color to create a lot of different flies. Now we're going to tie the Royal Humpy, and we'll show you some of the different colors you can do. The materials you're going to need for the Royal Humpy include moose body hair, 6/0 pre-waxed thread, dry fly hooks, also either calf hair or calf tail, and saddle hackles, whether it be brown or other colors, and poly dubbing, and of course deer hair or elk hair for the body. Now let's go on to the Royal Humpy. Start your thread just like you did on the Humpy and go halfway up the hook from the bend to the eye. Now we're going to put on some moose body hair for the tail. Trim it just like you did on the Humpy. Make sure all the proportions are right. Throw a little bit of a loop on your thread and wrap lightly to the back and tighter towards the middle of the fly. Now we're ready to tie on the wing. Now let's look at some calf hair or tail. Now the calf tail is very kinky and hard to work with, where your body hair is much more even, a lot thicker, and will stack a lot better than your tail. Again, tail on the left, body hair on the right. Much easier to work with the body hair when tying the Royal Humpy. Now let's prepare our wing. We're going to cut out some hair from the body, and we're going to use our finger to get out all the smaller fibers before we stack it. Now stack your wing and check out your proportion. It should only be halfway between the end of your body to your eye of your hook with your thread. Now, measure your wing so it's the same length as your shank from the eye to the bend. Tie it in very tightly. Push up and check your proportion. It should be a 45-degree angle from your tail to your wing. Trim it off. You should trim all the smaller fibers off, but leave a little bit of it at the end, a little kind of a butt section there. Now lift your wing forward and tie underneath it. And this is important to tie into the wing so it doesn't go forward. Now you can cover up that butt at the end. All right, you can cover it up, make sure it's in very tightly. Now we're going to wrap in front of the wing because we want that wing to stand up. It's very important. And we build it up and keep building it up so it stands straight up just like that. Now we're going to divide it. So we want to make sure again that it's standing straight up. We're going to take half on one side, on half the other, and then use our Xing pattern. One from behind the wing, then in front of the wing. There we go again, just forming a little X dividing the wing. Now check it out to the front and make sure you have it divided equally. Now we're going to wrap around the wing. You do it slowly but deliberately, grabbing the wing each time you wrap around. Make a couple wraps just to divide it out, just like that, to make sure that you do have it equal. Now you can trim out some of the renegade fibers there with your scissor points. It's really important to have a good sharp pair of scissors here. I'll tell you, that old calf hair can really run a pair of scissors. Now we're going to wrap around the wing until we can cover most of the white. Again, you wrap it deliberately, and the wing closest to you, you can wrap a little bit slower with the wing being straight out. And a little bit of a pull will bring that wing right up so it's divided. Now see that white there? You want to cover that white, because if you push that wing forward, it will eventually slip off. So keep wrapping until you cover all the white. We don't want to see any white there. Now a couple more Xing patterns between the wings, and you have a complete divided wing. Now this wing won't pull out. Now it's time to get some body hair. So we're going to trim off some dyed brown deer hair. Boy, isn't that a nice looking color? And we're going to clear out all the loose fibers so they're all equally. It's not necessary to stack this because we're going to trim it at the end. We don't really care that the fibers may not be completely even. Now let's turn it around and we're going to cut it, trim it like that. We're going to tie in the ends of the hair instead of the butt ends like we tie in a humpy. Trimming it down, we're getting it just prepared just right. Now we're going to tie it in just like we would a humpy. There we go. Had to make a couple false wraps there. Now we're going to wrap it up there. Looks good. Now, you don't have to be really too conscious of having your thread cover all the deer hair because we're going to dub in a body. Now we're going to pull it up and give it a slight twist. Oop, there's a little renegade one. We got to get him out of there. Now check out your proportions. Should look right. And we're ready to put on a little bit of dubbing here. And we're going to put on kind of a light green poly dubbing. And one of the mistakes a lot of people make is they put on too much dubbing. Put on a little at a time, and you'll find it will go on a lot easier. You might want to put a little wax on your thread, but I tend to use wax monocord, and it works out real well. Now we're ready. We're going to pull back the deer hair, get a few of those little renegades out of there. Now we're going to wrap forward. Here we go with a nice, even body. Now, I'll tell you, you don't have to worry about wrapping a bunch of thread, and we've got a body that will really absorb materials. Now, we're going to bring forward the deer hair just between the wings and wrap over a couple nice, easy wraps over the body. Now, this is important. You notice I haven't pulled down on it. I just wrapped over it. trimmed it out, and there's a little bit of it still there. Now we're going to cut that off, and I actually have a little bit of a butt, and it hasn't been trimmed tightly. You can see it right there. See that little butt? It's just sort of like, looks like irresistible. Now we're going to wrap the thread through that tighter, tighter, tighter. And eventually we're going to have it tied down. Now this will keep the body from pulling out. There we go. We're wrapping it up. One of the problems with the Royal Humpty is that body will pull out from the wing. Now we're going to look at some saddle hackle. And we're using some Mets here. This is a little longer. And boy, works great on your larger flies. Now, if you're going to tie 14s and 16s, 18s, you're going to have to go to neck hackle. And I recommend either Spencer's or Mets or some of the new generic hackles. There are far better buys than the traditional Indian neck hackle. Okay, let's take a look at this. Now, we're going to tie in the butt. Now, notice that the shiny side is facing us. That's important. Okay, we're going to tie the butt in. We're going to check it out, pull on it, and make sure that it is tied in. Now, it's important to wrap in front of the wing to make sure you have a nice threshold to tie your hackle onto. Now, we're going to wrap our hackle, a couple wraps in back, or a couple to 2 to 3 at least, and we want to do the same in the front so we can put the wing in the middle of the hackle so it balances out properly. Let's not crowd our head because we want the fly to balance out properly. Notice how wrapping 2 hackles at once, how even the hackle comes out instead of wrapping one at a time. Now, if you have problems doing this, refer back to the Humpy, and I think it'll work out real well for you, showing you how to wrap 2 hackles at once. But if you do have a problem, just wrap one at a time. Now, we're going to use our fingers to separate our wing, and we're going to do the whip finish. Now, a little later on, we're going to show you how to do the old Thompson whip finish. Now, whip it out, use our finger to hold it down and snap it out, and there we go, the old Royal Humpty made easy. At least we hope it's made easy for you.
Well, as you can see, it's pretty straightforward, but it changed a lot of the way people looked at Humpies, which were great flies, but hard to see. One of the questions was asking, do I get together with other tyers? What do we do when we come up with variations of flies? And do we get on the water? Well, both Mike Lawson and I had the great ability to have guides, and we could take fly patterns and have them try them. So they were our testers. But we did share with other tyers. We'd get together events. There were tying events and sport shows. I spent, almost 50 years doing sport shows and teaching. And you always traveling the world, whether it be New Zealand or Australia or Canada, you pick up ideas. You've got to listen to whatever tyer there is, and it's just an important part. But we would usually test a fly, Mike and I, and Mike had far more flies because of technical fishing on the Henry's Fork. He learned quite early in the game to you'd have to have the exact imitations, and you would have to really work hard. But we both used a couple years before we would put patterns into the customer's hands. And of course, one of the things that made Umpqua so special is they could duplicate it. I'll just admit to you, they could tie my patterns better than I could on many of them. And so just because you might have crafted the fly and given it a name doesn't mean you're going to tie it the best. One of the, I think, important parts was our friendship between Gary LaFontaine and Mike Lawson and the traveling fly fishermen. That was a part where we had a chance to travel, and each one of us had different perspectives. And we learned as much from the people we were teaching as they might have learned from us. Flies are such an important part, but I have a real, I don't know if you'd call it a rule, but I like less patterns and more sizes. In reality, if you could fish anywhere in the world, you could probably get by with 20 patterns if you had them in the right sizes and colors. But that'll only catch about 80% of the fish. And it's that 20% of the fish that you can't catch that makes Umpqua have about 3,000 or 4,000 different patterns. There's always a search for a better pattern. And I can tell you, this is really important. I've watched fisheries that I have fished for years, year after year, where fish would get, especially with catch and release, where they would just that next year, it was a hot fly. The next year they wouldn't touch it. And you can put whatever scientific thing about they have no memories or anything, but anybody out there knows what I'm talking about. And that is another reason why and you can go back 3 years later and all of a sudden it's back there with you and the fly's working. So that tends to make fly boxes a lot bigger and longer. I just got through retiring over 30 boxes worth of flies to start all over again because I don't need that many flies. So anyway, some of the great stories that we had in the travels, and I think this is one of the really great stories about Mike and Gary, and it has to do with vices. When we started out doing the traveling fly fisherman, we ended up with vices, different companies with different vices. I won't mention the names, but one of them was a rotary vice, and Mike Lawson got so tired of it, he picked it up and threw it. And of course, it was in front of a bunch of people, and that was the end of that contract for that vice. And then we had another one. It was just absolutely beautiful. Unfortunately, it went out of business. And so we were down to the Regal Vice. And the guy that originally owned Regal was quite a character. And Gary used a Regal Vice. It was all beat up and he had bolts on it. And it was a one, on a pedestal. And so we're at the show in, it was in Massachusetts. And this is where the company was at. And anyway, Gary was tying, and he had sent us all new vices, and Gary didn't want to use the new vices. Mike and I were just happy as could be with it. And the guy comes up to him, and Gary doesn't know who he is. And Gary's tying. He says, "Well, what did you do with the new vice that I sent you?" And he goes, "Well, I threw that way. It was a piece of junk." And he didn't even look up. And the guy just reached down and grabbed that old vice and then headed for the door. And Gary tackled him. And his guy was a big guy. And here come the show people, and we had this big tussle. And Gary got his vice back. And of course, that was the end of that contract. But we had a lot of really, really good adventures. I could literally write a book on all the traveling fly fishermen. We went to Australia, went to New Zealand, went to Canada, all over the USA. And it was a real brotherhood. And all three of us were different. And also in political views. Gary was left, Mike was right, and I was in the middle. And in scientific stuff, Gary was on one side, and had to have, and every time he'd say, "Look, if you use this fly and use this method, it worked 85% of the time." And I look back at Lawson, and his eyes would be rolled, and his head would be going up. And that just, and I just, we all had our own idiosyncrasies. And we get in there, and Gary get the New York Times, and he'd sit in the corner, and Mike and I would do all the stuff. And then when the people come, Gary would go out and hold them off and do stories and everything, and then would get it done. We all had a piece of the action and made it work. Unfortunately, Gary left us far too early. But Mike and I continued on, and each of us think back about how much we learned from each other. And Okay, sorry about it. I had a pop-up there. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, we're going to be going into the next fly. Uh, I don't know what our timing is right now, but the next fly. Whoops! I'll tell you how prepared I am. I didn't put up my sheet about the listing of the flies. Stimulator. Okay, thank you. I've got this person watching over me. Well, let's talk about Randall Kaufman because we still fish together. Uh, wow, way over 50 years. We figured 60 years and counting of friendship. And I watched uh, Randall from the start. He was one of the real people that helped Dennis get started because he was in Oregon and he worked hard in helping Dennis pick out the right flies, and especially with his knowledge of nymphs. But he came up with this fly. It was really and I've seen people say, well, he didn't invent it. Randall has never said to me, and I've talked to him about, he didn't invent the fly. He crafted the fly over uh, existing patterns like the bucktail caddis, and it just kind of in a lot of flies they all kind of come together at the same time. I mean, it's not rocket science, it's just creativity. But he did give it the name Stimulator, and there was another name out there called Simulator, so there was a little confusion there. But it was a brilliant fly. It was the fly that came out about the same time as the elk hair caddis, but it didn't match some of the stonefly patterns. And it gets back to the point is you don't necessarily have to have the exact imitation. It has to be the size, and that's number one importance, the size. And it has to be the presentation. How does it float in the water? The bucktail caddis floated way too high. And we've got more and more conscious of how a fly is presented in the water because of the catch and release. The more catch and release gave fish more of a chance to say, whoops, I've seen that before. And I think that's been one of the big things that we've looked for different ways and we're more conscious about how the presentation is with the fly. And we'll be talking, another thing that's great about the stimulators, you can always throw a uh, emerging caddis behind it. And one of the great fishing adventures I had on the South Fork, where we just right up to like midnight catching fish, swinging uh, caddis emergers with a stimulator, which is a great way to do it, and moving it across the water. And they'd take the stimulator, thinking it was laying eggs, and they'd take the emerger, and it was just a great time that I'll never forget in the moonlight. Uh, those are memories that you don't ever. And by the way, this Randall just had an inversion to wanting to do video. He wouldn't do video at all. And I got two flies, the only two flies he ever tied on video. And this stimulator is one of them. And then he did the formulator, I believe, and in another time. But I get him on the camera every once in a while. He kind of trusted me that I'd make him look good. So anyway, let's go to the stimulator.
Well, we have a hooking device. It's a Tiemco 200 RBL, which is a barbless. And we'll start by clipping off a little bit of some elk hair for a tail. And as you can see, we've got some short hairs and some long hairs in here, so we pulled out the short ones. And there's always a lot of them in there. And that leaves us with a clump like this, which we're going to stack. So it goes in the stacker. Tap it on down so the tips are all the same length. And that's going to be our tail. You position the thread at about the 60% mark. And our tail should be fairly short. Start that off. Secure it down back toward the end of the hook. Take a few more secure turns and the tail is in place. Now as we're trimming off all these little butt ends, try to grab them all in your finger and make one angled cut, nice and clean. Alright, now we are ready for a rib, which will secure our hackle in place. So we just tie that fine wire on there, and the dubbing comes next. And this is a fly that you can tie any color. I'm going to do a yellow one, which can represent some stoneflies and some caddis, some hoppers. So we just take a little bit of thread out, and we're just kind of changing the color of the thread actually. And we just wind that around here nice and sparse and level so as not to make a fat lumpy body. You know, spread it out some on the thread before you dub it on. And we just work our way up the body here a little bit further. Just takes a little bit more to finish this off. And now we're at about the 60% mark on the hook. So we select out a saddle hackle. And this is a brown with a black center, which is referred to as a furnace. And I like to have a little bit of black in the center there. It kind of breaks up the pattern of the color. And so strip off a few fibers there on the edge. And tie it in so that the shiny side is facing away from you. So start spiraling that hackle toward the rear of the hook. Take a couple turns here in the front, and then over the top and hold it. Very efficient. Over and hold it. Come over and hold it. Over and hold it. Now to secure it in place, we're going to use this fine wire rib. So we bring the wire around and catch that hackle tip and just bring it on forward, securing the hackle in place, providing maybe a little flash and a lot of durability. Tie this off on front, then we'll trim off this hackle tip nice and close. Tip of your scissors. And this is hard on scissors, but we'll just trim that wire anyway. Okay, now we are ready for the wing, which will be some white elk. So we'll cut a piece of that out like we did for the tail. We'll pull out all those short little fuzzy fibers, which just get in the way and slow down the stacking process. Drop those tips in the stacker. A few good taps, and we have a wing ready to go. We'll pull out a few of those short ones the other direction now. And this will be our wing. And it should extend about to the bend of the hook. So if you hold it in your right hand and you measure the distance, change hands, come up between the fingers, secure it in place, you have a wing. Now all these little fibers here on the ends of the hair can be rather unruly. But if you can sweep them all between your fingers and make one clean cut, kind of at an angle, see if we can get them all here, some are kind of short, well, I will be set. I missed a couple of them. So we'll just fix them up there. And just build up a good little thread base here where we're going to tie in our thorax and our rubber legs. Now, you know, if you're fishing in the Rocky Mountains, you need to have rubber legs. At least that's what all of the locals tell you. So we'll just trim off a couple pieces of rubber here. And we'll tie one section in away from you, kind of on the far side of the hook, about like so. And one on the other side, like so. We'll have a little palmered hackle through the thorax, so we have some grizzly here. And again, we'll just strip off some of the fibers on the end. And we'll tie it in with the shiny side away from us. Okay, so now we are ready to install the thorax, and this will be a fluorescent, kind of a fire red thorax. And you can use whatever you feel like on this, but it helps if you have something fine that dubs on real thin and easy. You can see how fast this rolls onto the thread. If you just roll your fingers the same direction and put lots of pressure in there, you'll have no trouble with your dubbing, as long as you don't put on too much. So now we're going to finish off this thorax. Stroke those rubber legs out of the way. And leave some space for the head. You don't want to crowd the eye of the hook too much. Okay, now we're ready to wrap the grizzly hackle. So we just take a turn behind those, in front of the rubber, and we just palmer this on through the fly. Sometimes that rubber gets in the way, so just pull it out. So again, we can just wrap over the top and hold it, come over and hold it. Now as we tie it off, just bring the thread behind there, take a couple secure turns, put the tip of the scissors right on the hook shank and make one clean cut, and a few more turns of thread and a couple half hitches up front. Then we'll cinch them back nice and tight, and we have a rubber leg stimulator pretty much ready to go to work, except that we want to even up the legs a little bit. And you can kind of manhandle them around to position them right. And then what I like to do is to lift up the wing tall, spread it out wide so that you have a nice wide silhouette from below. And the same on the tail, spread it out wide, which helps kind of stabilize the fly and gives it a broad silhouette from the underside. I'll just take this out here, maybe we can get a little view of that. Can we see that on the underside? I think we can see that the wing is spread out wide and it is tall. Now it's time to take it fishing, huh, Jack?
Well, you can see that Randall should have done more video. Don't ask me why, but he's a great instructor and had a wonderful time over the years. I did several forwards for his book, and we fished together now. Last year we had a wonderful trip on the Bighorn in Wyoming, by Thermopolis, Wyoming. The only problem is none of us can see, after it starts getting a little low in light, none of us can see to tie on the size 20s that we need to fish, but somehow we struggle through it as best we can. He's upstream with his light on, and I'm downstream, and all we hear is a bunch of cuss words. And neither one of us can neither one of us can get it before the other person, and we both end up struggling. We've had some questions here, and one of them is, do the rivers fish differently in the 70s than now? Actually, most of the rivers I know fish better now than it did in the 70s. You had bigger fish, but you didn't have, and the reason you had bigger fish is because people were catching and keeping fish. That's just what the culture was back then. And so you would have a lot of little fish, and then in the middle where your spawners were, you would have left fish, but you would have the survivors of the catch and keep were in many cases bigger, but that's not necessarily. If you look at some of the well-managed Montana streams and you look at New Zealand, you can certainly get big fish with your catch and release. But what you do see in the Wyoming streams is you see a much bigger average fish and many more. Our population in the Snake River has tripled since, maybe more than that, maybe 4 or 5 times what it was when I was first guiding in the 1960s. It's just much better. Now, one of us was some head cement not really used before. No, I know Randall used half hitches. If you're using half hitches, you definitely need cement. I never found that if you use a whip finish, that it really needed to be cemented. And most of the time, you end up cementing the heads and end up closing the eye. And that's when we talked about small flies and trying to thread them at low light. That's the last thing you want. But I've always felt a good whip finish probably does it. But there are times you need cement, especially with streamers and heads on streamers, which do come off. And especially the one fly, that's one of the things I was involved in starting. And one of the things is important to the one fly. If you have the right fly, you want to make sure it stays together. And so many of the flies in Umpqua sell were winners in the one fly. And people always say, well, what is the fishing contest? And it's really a fun event. It's kind of laughing at what a fishing contest is. Nothing's fair. The only way you could make it fair is everybody fished the same lake at the same spot with the same fly. But what it did create was fly creativity. You could try to craft a fly a little bit different and go from there. And so cement definitely has its place. Now let's talk about Mike Lawson a little bit, because we're going to be doing one of my absolute favorites. I did last year my favorite flies for my limited edition fly collection. Every year I do 28 sets, and it's getting where the small flies. I think every year I say, well, I'm not going to tie any 18s, then I'm not going to tie any 16s. It just keeps creeping up. But I do these sets, and I put this fly in the set because it's in my boxes and all the sizes for PMDs, and that is his cripple. I watched him through the development period, tying it and seeing what people thought about it and having his guides fish it. And the idea that we all had come that the cripples were an amazing part, especially in the spring in the blueing olives, because all it takes is a cloud to go by. And at that time of the year, the temperature drops. When the temperature drops, that shuts the hatch down. And what usually happens, they can't shed the shuck. Ooh, you can't say that too fast. But the shuck is still attacked. And then a lot of times the wind will blow them away, because when the clouds come over, the wind comes up. And it's really important. And I have great video in the videos that I did with Mike of the fish going around and just plucking up the cripples and leaving the duns on the water. It's much easier to get a stranded, I guess it's the old shark attack. If that fly isn't going to move out of their way, and trout don't want to expend a lot of energy. They want to get whatever's the easiest to eat, and the cripples are wonderful. And that Mike did the kind of the anti, where you have the body being sunk, but the thorax up in the water. Again, PMDs and bluing ollies. This is a pattern I wouldn't be without, and it's a pattern I go to. If they're not taking the adults and we're coming up and refusing of getting close, invariably I can put this pattern on, and it works. It has been a lifesaver for me. So anyway, we're going to go in. I guess we've got some other patterns coming at you, and I guess I'm waiting for my host to tell me what's the next one. It's totally unprepared. I'm not one of those. A cripple done is, oh, that's right. We're talking about Lawson's fly. Why would I not do that? Anyway, on this fly, don't hesitate to go to the real small things. I'd like to just add one of the things that I've found that, and this is a advice on fishing booing ollies, which I spent a lot of time fishing, as it was a favorite mayfly of Gary LaFontaine's and of Mike's, because it comes out in the spring and the fall. But one of the things that I found is when they first come out, an 18, sometimes 16s, and 20s, but 18s seem to work. And all of a sudden, they quit working. And what I realized is the pseudochlorians, the small, I call them damn small betas, and the fish will leave the big flies and start taking these betas. They're very prolific, and you don't really see them. You're looking at the bigger betas. And I'm a big proponent of two flies, two dries, a bigger one that I can see, and it's usually my Periwolf, Adam's Periwolf, and then I will add anywhere from 8 to 10 inches, maybe sometimes a little bit more, just depending, a little closer on the smaller flies, and then put like a 24, I call it Beefus Betas, which is a micro betas that Brad Beefus does for Umpqua. Absolutely a killer. When I get refusals, that fly goes on, but it goes on with the two fly method. And the same on this fly here. Don't hesitate. It's strong enough and built well to float that you can't drift an emerger right behind it. Two flies matching the hat, very important. It's something we learned when in the 70s and brought back to Emmett Heath on the Green River, the two fly system, which there they were using a big attractor fly and heavier nymph. And they were making one cast over a fish. And if you didn't want the dry, you'd take the nymph, because every cast, your percentage would go down. First cast, if you do it right, New Zealand, 80% is going to take the fly. Second cast, it drops to 40. Third cast, down. So that was what they did is a way to minimize the casting. What we did with Emmett and I, and it all kind of pushed through our lectures, to do the matching of the hats with two flies, emergers, the dry, mergers, and the nymph. So that was a big look at for us to take what we learned in New Zealand and modify it to our conditions. And Mike was the master of that. And there isn't a fly tyer that I have more respect for than Mike Lawson and his beautiful cripple done. So let's take it away.
A situation that you often encounter when you're fishing spring creeks and tailwaters is when there's a lot of mayflies on the surface, but the trout don't seem to be taking the duns. And in most cases, they're feeding on emergers or what we call cripples. And I want to tie a cripple here for you, which essentially just all a cripple means is a mayfly that during the emerging process got stuck or in the nymphal shuck or just didn't make it. And they get part way out and then they just stay that way and they just drift down on the surface, and the trout really quickly pick up on how vulnerable these crippled mayflies are, and they sometimes will feed exclusively on them. And the idea in tying our fly is we're going to put the imitation of the nymphal shuck on the back, and then the front part of the fly is going to imitate the wing that has pulled out of the nymphal shuck but hasn't made it all the way out. It's a mayfly stuck in the nymphal shuck. We're going to start out then. We're going to put a little bit of wire. We're going to put a little bit of pheasant tail. we're going to start out then in putting the shuck on, and a simple way to do that is to add some marabou. And the marabou that I'm going to use is colored to imitate the color of the nymph, not the dun. And in this case, I'm going to use kind of a rusty colored marabou. Another thing that I think is important in tying a fly like this is we want the nymphal shuck to be under the surface. We want it to break the surface, so I'm going to use very water absorbent materials like marabou that also gives a little bit of a life to it. Tied the marabou in by the tip to leave a little bit for the tail. And I'm also going to tie some of this wire, and I'm going to use a dubbing loop on this, which is going to double the wire around the marabou. Now, you don't have to do this. If you wanted to take the step of just wrapping the marabou and then ribbing the wire, you can certainly do that as well. I'm making a little loop in this wire that is just a little bit shorter than the marabou is long. And I'm going to put just a little bit of wax up here on the end of this, because sometimes the marabou tends to want to slide out when I spin this in with my little dubbing twister. Okay, I'm going to hold the loop open, go inside the loop over the marabou and catch the back side of the loop with the other end of this, and then pull this tight. And then we're going to twist this. What we're doing is just twisting the marabou around the wire. And then we'll wrap it halfway up the shank of the hook to form the nymphal shuck. I can see a little bit of that wire showing through, and that's good. I think that gives a little bit more of a lifelike appearance to the fly. But the other thing that it does for us is that it will add just about enough weight on the back of this hook to break the surface film, and that's really important. So there's the nymphal shuck far back. I only want a little bit of it, so I'm just going to break the rest of it off. Breaking it off looks a lot more natural than cutting it, where I have a real steep angle there to cut. We've got the back part of the fly tied now, the nymphal shuck. So the next thing we're going to do is put a little bit of dubbing to imitate the color of the mayfly dun as it's emerging from the nymphal case. We'll just put a little bit of this superfine dubbing. We use a pale yellow. You could also use olive, tan, or a light gray to imitate other kinds of mayflies. And then the last thing we're going to do is put the wing. Make sure to allow plenty of room at the head for the wing, because we're going to use some deer hair and tie some hackle here. So we cut a little bit of gray deer hair. You don't need to use a lot. It's one of the most common mistakes is to overdress these mayfly cripples, because there's a lot of material to put on, and you got to stay fairly sparse with how much you use. Got a little bit of deer hair here now, and I'm just going to stack this to get the tips even. And you don't need to have a very long wing here. The wing should be less than the length of the body, about 2/3 of the length of the body. Hold it in place and make a couple of wraps over the top. Just kind of flare this out a little bit. Make some tight wraps. What we got to do here is We cut the hair back just a little bit to kind of give the appearance of a wing case that's kind of just emerging. The last thing we do is we do put a hackle. We only put a couple of turns of hackle, and we're going to go right around the wing. Take one hackle, cut the portion of it off that's got webbing on it, and then tie it in tightly. We got the hackle tied in now just behind the wing. We'll take our hackle pliers now and just make 2 wraps of hackle around the wing. And then tie it off. And what the appearance this gives us is that the wing will stick above the surface of the water, and the rest of the fly will hang just below the surface. And one reason that these kinds of flies are so effective is because when I see trout feeding on very smooth surfaces, like we often find on a spring creek, they hold very close to the surface as they feed. And the trout's window, his window of vision, actually is a cone that extends 97 degrees out from his eyes. So the closer he is to the surface, the smaller his window is. Everything above the surface can only be seen through his window. Everything else is just a reflection of the bottom. And when a trout is holding so close to the surface, his window is so small that he really doesn't see things that are actually on the surface. He's picking out things that are suspended in the surface film. And that's why when you have a fly like this, you want it to be drifting with the shuck down under the surface so the trout can really key on it. And that's what makes the cripple so effective.
Mike said something really important about the window being smaller when they're close to the surface. There's another reason too. When they're taking spinners, they'll do the same thing. They'll get because they can't see them in the film, is they'll come up and come right straight down. And what happens is you can't, on both these scenarios, you can't cast 6 feet in front of the rise, is they just won't see it. And so when you see a rise, you've got to be like 6 inches, 8 inches in front of it. And when I've taken people on the bighorn, this is one of the things that they're so conditioned to throw 6 feet in front of a fly or 2 feet or whatever they're used to. It's hard to get them to be able to put it right on that rise, especially on trichos. Same thing. They'll come up, boom, boom. They just keep going because they know the trichos are coming. So that's another thing that I think was very important about what Mike said. We've got several questions here, and one, it was going to be quite a long one, and that is, what have I seen change in the fly fishing business in the last 50 years? Well, I could probably write a total book on that. I think one of the biggest changes, I don't know if I have it here to show you. Yeah, I do. When I started fishing, this is how we prepared a leader right here. These are gut leaders. These are from my old days. These leaders are probably, at least 65 years old, before nylon. You had to soak them in this little box and then tie them on, and they had to be soaked just right or they would fray. And then you had to put floating on your fly line, and then we had silk lines. And the cane rods were fine. I mean, the rods were not a problem, and the reels weren't a problem. We had plenty of good reels, not as light as what we have right now, but they worked. So as we go into the 60s, which is, I think, the real changing, the late 60s to the 70s, when fly fishing changed. There were more good flies to buy. There were nylon leaders, replaced the gut leaders. There were floating fly lines. You didn't have to. But one of the big things, and I think it was, and that was waders. Waders that were comfortable to wear instead of hip boots. So equipment is a big part of that. Better flies, better floating, all kinds of things. And I have to laugh because everybody buys Gerke's gink. And I remember when George he said, I got this new floating, it's going to kill him dead. He says, my friend in the movie business gave me a 50-gallon jug of makeup remover, and I helped him put that makeup remover by heating it into the Gerke Gink bottles. And he went to the show and just sold them like it was, because all we had was those days were muslin. So a big part of what has happened is a change in what we have out here. And another is education. And that is really more than anything. There were no fly classes. You had to go to a club and maybe get into cast. There wasn't any sophisticated teaching methods. There wasn't videos then. Books were not readily available. And one of the reasons we did our book was to show every method. There would be books that showed 6 methods and leave them out, and people would be frustrated. And of course, video was just the greatest thing that ever happened to teaching somebody fly tying. It just cut out a lot of the stages. Nothing beats a book to learn about it, but it's a real ongoing, growing industry. And I could take all kinds of shots of there's too many rods, too many of this, too many of that, too many people doing this, too that. You can complain about the actual business until you're blue in the face. But it couldn't be a better time to be a fly fisherman. Now I hear a lot of people say the streams are too crowded, and you can build any number of tennis courts and all kinds of basketball things, but you can't build trout streams. So it's important that an organization like Trout Unlimited, who is a big sponsor of our show here, has done so much. I was great friends with Kurt Gowdy and got to know Ben Crosby, who was on the first Trout Unlimited board. They had a powerhouse board and were able to really make this organization go. I gave my very first lecture at a Trout Unlimited banquet in Denver, and they were only like 6 years into their organization, and it was amazing to go 50 years later and give another lecture after all those years. So I've watched that organization really, and the Federation of Fly Fishermen, which now is the International Federation of Fly Fishermen, really helped teach a lot of people through the California and the West Coast, and it's still a very viable organization. There isn't any reason, when I tell people the most important advice I can get, we have right now, is find a fly shop. Go in there, buy some stuff, get to know the people. And before you ask anywhere you go traveling, buy something. Buy some flies. You can always use flies. Buy something other than a license. They make nothing off the license. And then the more you buy and the more you talk, and you don't try to overwhelm them, you'll be surprised. You might even, the guy might say, hey, well, you want to go with me in the afternoon? I'm going to go out after. There's so much you can learn from a fly shop. And I know, being in the business for 50 years, having a fly shop, we were lucky to get some wonderful people like Jeff Curry, who ran our fishing department, along with Scott Sanchez. And it was taking the time. And one of the greatest awards of my life was in 2007 when Outdoor Magazine gave us a once-in-a-lifetime thing, calling us the greatest outfitter in the world, because the greatest fishing outfitter in the world, because we had people that had gone to China and gone all over the place, which now is a common thing. But back then, it was something that, in the way we trained our guides, it was a great honor. So I think it's important, whether it's the Henry Fork Anglers, whether it's shops in Denver, find a reputable shop and get to know them, and you'll learn an awful lot and take advantage of the programs they bring, especially casting. Casting is 90% of getting better at fly fishing. Now, one of the questions too is, can you discuss a view on proper proportion materials on the hook? Well, I think one of the most important things is perspective, and you have to look at dividing things in half. You do divide things in half every day when you drive on a road. You have markings, but once you get off on a road in the country, it doesn't have markings. You've got to figure out where the middle of the road is. It's called perspective. You look up at a picture, and I can go over there and point out and look at it and say, that's half of it. And I'll guarantee you that will be half of it. I was a portrait artist before I became a professional fly fisherman. And so I knew about proportions. And you'll find that most of your fly tyers have an art background and can draw and everything. So you look at that and you divide the hook in half. Okay, now on streamers and nymphs, it may go beyond that. But if we're talking about a dry fly, you divide it in half. That's where your tail should stop, where your body should stop. Then you divide it again in half to put your wings, and then leave plenty of room. It's really important to leave plenty of room to tie off your fly, because it's so easy to crowd the head. And you're not going to be very happy when you can't get the leader through and the trout are rising and it's the only one that you have. So it's important when you're tying to not, and also use lighter thread. Try to use the lightest thread. You can get more wraps, will give you a much tighter fly. And I'm a great believer in light threads. Of course, when you start working with deer hair, that's a little tougher. But one of the we talked about our traveling fly fishermen, and we always got the same question. People were always asking me about, they bring up flies and they say, well, how does this look? And it's really a tough thing. You got somebody, you're selling things, and you're not wanting to offend them. But I used to judge a lot of fly tying contests, and I did it by proportioning. And a fly can be tied poorly and still catch fish if the proportion's right, so it floats right. Proportioning is very important when it comes to dry flies. Having it, the last fly we're going is the Periwolf, which we talk about how important flotation is on our dry fly fishing. So we're going to be going into our next fly, and which is, I got to tell you the story of this, because this is quite an amazing story. So my wife decides to fish in the one fly, and we actually started the one fly in about 1974, and we couldn't get enough interest to get it going. And the one fly was really conceived. Kurt Gowdy and I used to have fly fishing contests with one fly. He had gone to the one-shot antelope hunt in Lander, Wyoming. He says, why can't we have a one fly? And Lee Wolf had wrote an article on, if you only had one fly, what would it be? And both Gowdy and I were picked to be one of the people. And Gowdy took the muddler minnow, and I don't even remember anymore what I picked. It probably would have been a woolly bugger or something like that. I don't even remember. Lee Wolf picked the Royal Humpty because he just loved dry fly fishing. That was his big thing. So anyway, he would announce the contest. We would go down the stream, and everybody in the world knew his voice from the Super Bowl and Major League Baseball. And here we go. Dennis makes a cast. Now, let's go to Howard Cosell. What did you think? He could do the best Howard Cosell you ever can imagine. And he'd go, well, let's go to this and to do interviews. And all the times we did, he never could beat me. And it really bothered him. He was very competitive. He was on the national championship. Only time Wyoming won a basketball title, a national title. He was on the team. But he gave the idea and we did it. So, okay, we're going to the one fly. All the time, I never tied any of the flies for the one fly. In the 10th anniversary contest, one of my friends said, can we use this fly from New Zealand? I know we've had several people watching from New Zealand. Welcome. And I hope the pandemic allows our American and all the visitors from around the world to go to that wonderful fishery. I can't imagine how good it's going to be. But anyway, my wife, who had sat through all the festivities, she said, I'm fishing. Okay. And my friend Dick Cheney, which would end up being long before he was going to be vice president, we've known each other since he struck me out in baseball and in Casper in the American Legion tournament. And so he said, you know, you've never tied a fly for me for the one fly. And my wife said, you never tied a fly. And the big flies at that time were the Chernobyl type ants. And I kept watching some of the deficiency in the ants and what could be done to make them better. And so I said, okay, I'll tie you the fly for the one fly. And so I said, what am I going to tie? So I started working on it, and I asked my guides, what do you think's wrong with Chernobyl? Well, it turns upside down, needs a wing. So and then I had one of my guides in Idaho did the chocolate ant that was just absolutely beautiful. And he used this really fantastic sparkle chenille. So I took a little of this, a little of that, just like baking a cake, and came up with this fly with the rubber legs. And my daughter Amy, and one of the keys was this sparkle that we were getting out of these wonderful fibers coming from Japan, but they put a glow out. My daughter was working with research on blood going through a Gore-Tex vein, and they would shine light through it. And her idea was, she'd see these fluttering stoneflies. He said, well, how can you make them flutter? Well, I said, you can't. There's no way you put a motor in it, but you could give them an illusion. And by putting that crystal flash in there, and that was her idea, it made it look like a fluttering stonefly. It really, really worked. We did several patterns on that, and it was the idea that kind of incorporated into this fly. So we had the fly. I take Dick out, and we're going to test the fly. He got 8 fish before we got out of and all were what we call measurable fish, over 13 inches. They were actually more like 17, 18 inches before we even got out of the sight of the Moose Bridge. He said, man, we knew we had something. So I tied him up for him, and I tied him up for my wife. And then I tied it up for the Frontier Anglers team. And all of a sudden, I'm getting all these people calling in favors, and I'm tying the flies out. In the deal, the Frontiers every one of them used the fly, and they won the contest. My wife got 4th. The team got 4th place. Cheney's was a little farther down there, but he did the best of his team and the Wyoming team. And the last place team used it. So I don't know how that equates, but I guess it depends on how you fish the fly. I think that's really important. A little bit of stripping, all kinds of ways to do that. But one of the used flies that one of the team members were using, and he'd thrown it away, one of the guides picked it up, and he was fishing the contest, Joe Bressler, and he used it and won the professional title using the fly, and then used the same fly again the next year to win it again, the same fly. So it caught quite a few fish. So it's been a very successful fly for Umpqua, for me. And of course, my daughter gets known, she's a physical therapy doctor in Utah. And she gets asked a lot if she's the Amy of the Amy's Ants. And it's now that she's such a big fly fisherman, she's found it's helped her. So anyway, let's go on. We've added some modifications. We now have a new fly coming out next year with Umpqua called the Amy Stonefly, which is a bigger version of this fly because we don't tie it big enough for the big stones. And it's actually a terrific stonefly pattern. And it also can be stripped at night and really works well. So that'll be a new pattern to kind of be looking at, and it'll come in 3 colors. So on to the Amy's Ant.
We're going to be using a 1X heavy hook, and we're going to use brown 6/0 thread. And we're going to already lay a base of thread, as you can see right now.
We're going to be using some closed cell foam. You can see it's about medium thickness, and we're going to trim it to be just a little longer than the shank. We can measure it up against the shank here, and we want it to go a little bit beyond that. So we're going to tie it in. Now at first I'm using some big wraps and crossing back and forth. Now you notice the eye of the hook is right there, and we're going to go right up to the eye. Now eventually we're going to trim that down and shape it, but for now we pretty much have it up to the eye. We're going to go back and forth, and each wrap I'm going to add a little bit more pressure. Back and forth, and it'll compress the foam so it's on nice and tight, and it will not rotate on you. Now we see that the foam is nice and compressed. We have plenty of wraps of thread on it, and we're ready to cut the back part of the foam. Now we're going to shape it. I'm going to tilt it here so you can see it, and you can come up with your own designs on how to shape this bottom part of the ant. You don't want to have it too long. I think when we finish the fly, you'll understand why. We're going to use some olive-colored crystal flash chenille.
And we're going to tie it in.
And then we're going to take a saddle. This is a light dun. It can even be a dark dun. I use dun. You could also substitute grizzly hackle too, but I like the dun. We're going to tie it in and then move our thread to the front. Now we're going to grasp the chenille and move it forward, just like that, right up. We're going to leave a little space here. So you notice this right here, just a little bit of space, about 3/4 of the way down the shank. And we're going to trim, tie it off. And at the same time, you don't even need any hackle pliers. You have a saddle long enough, you're going to wrap it forward just like this. Just want a little bit of hackle there. Looks like a woolly worm with foam underneath it. Trim off our hackle. We have another piece of closed cell foam, a dark brown, that we're going to lay on top. We've already trimmed it out. We're going to lay it right on just like this. Make a couple loose wraps until we have it in position. Make sure that it's a little bit beyond the body part of the foam, the tan foam. And then we're going to tighten it up with a couple, 3 more wraps. Now we're going to use some round rubber legs, dark brown, and this is medium size, and I've cut 4 of them just in one big cut, about 2 inches. And we're going to take one of those, separate it right from the group, Now we're going to lay it right in to the side of the body just like that. Make one wrap to make sure that the legs separate just like that. You don't want to have one up and one down, but if they're put in properly, they'll be just coming straight out of the body. Now we'll make a couple wraps to tighten it up. Now they may start to come in on you like this, and that means it's kind of slipped in there, so you may have to bring your thread up over like that and move them around. You don't want them to have them right tight together. Okay, now we're going to get another one just like, and we've already, of course, got the same size because we cut them all at once. We're going to do the same thing on the other side. Lay it in, make one wrap. Now one thing you got to watch is to make sure you don't wrap your thread around like that underneath the hook. So once you get it in and you feel like you have it in position, then wrap about 3 or 4 more wraps. And then take a look at your legs and make sure that they're all in place. That looks pretty good. Now we're going to take our thread and advance it through the body, just like that, right up to the front where we have this little space. At the same time, we're going to pull our foam forward and tie it down, kind of like a humpback there. And we'll build a kind of a base in there. And make sure that you take your thread back to this tan underbody, just like that. Ah, that looks good. Almost looks like a sandwich right there. Now, what we're going to do is cut some pearl crystal flash. It's going to be an underwing. How many strands? Well, if you want to count them out, it's going to be about 25 strands. If you don't want to count them out and not take about 2 hours to tie this fly, just a nice little group. Kind of measure it up against maybe half the gap width will help you in how many you need. All right, we're going to lay it in so that it... Now, the nice thing about this, if you get it too long, you can always trim it. Now we're going to tie it in and make sure it doesn't twist on you. It's very important. Make a couple loose wraps, make sure it's right up on top, then you spread it out a little bit. It shouldn't be beyond the tail part of this fly, so you want to just come and just trim it up a little bit like that. Now we're going to get some elk hair. This is some light elk body hair. And we're going to trim them out. And this again is going to take a little practice for you. You want to also stack it too. We're going to stack it here. We have a nice bunch of elk hair, about the gap width. We're going to put it in our stacker, drop it in, stack it, and it's going to come back up nice and even. I'm going to grab it and then lay it in. Now before you lay it in, grab a hold of the ends and make sure you get all the loose little guard hairs and fur out of that. You can also comb it out if you have one of the little dubbing combs. A couple loose wraps. Now I'm going to add a little bit of water-based cement. It's a very flexible cement. And we're going to put it in and let it penetrate. While it's penetrating, while the glue is drying, I'm going to add a little wax and some Arizona Crystal Rabbit olive color. And we're going to just dub it right on. Dub it on fairly loose. I'm dubbing in this Arizona Crystal Rabbit, and we're going to tie it in covering up the thread. And it's going to help anchor the hair. Now at this point we can roll over this foam and then tie it down. Now you can notice we've got a large piece of that foam hanging there. I'm going to turn it so you can see it a little bit better. We're going to come in and trim it just like that. And tie a few more wraps. Now we're ready to add the front legs. Can't have a ant with legs on the back and not the front. So we're going to reach around. We should have 2 legs left. And we're going to put them right in on the side, lay them in. And you'll get, the more you tie these, the more you'll get where you can put them in equally. Other than the first time, you're going to have to kind of play with it with that first tie before you tie it in with your anchoring wraps. Now we're going to go to the other side. You should only have one leg remaining now. We don't want to make this into a cripple, so we're going to put legs on the other side. Nice loose wrap until we get it on. Make sure that it's nice and even. And tie it down. Now you got to watch that you don't do that. Tie down that back leg because you got legs going everywhere. At that point, you can kind of take a look at your fly, make sure everything looks right. And you're going to bring your thread forward, make one wrap right in between the foams, and then the other wrap in front of the eye. And we'll get our whip finish and whip it off, and that will complete the fly. And we'll take a look at our Amy's ant. There it is. Now, it doesn't look like any ant. My daughter, actually, who I named this fly to, said, "Dad, ants don't have 8 legs," and she's right, but this really is to imitate a stonefly. The Chernobyl ant is just what the name says. Chernobyl ant means it's a mutant ant. Hung around Russia too long. This was the winning fly in the Jackson Hole 1 fly. The Frontier International Anglers used this fly exclusively to win the 1999 1 fly here at Jackson Hole. It's a terrific fly. You can use it for any kind of terrestrial. It'll work great for you.
Well, we're back after the Amy's ant. We've added a few little twists in the newer version, just like anything else. One of the interesting parts of any of our fly tying is how we take a look at modifications, and I think everything modifies, and that's what's made it so wonderful for companies like Umpqua to go out and search and find out all the new patterns and new ways of tying things. One of the things that I did see, I had a question about the Amy's ant from a friend of mine, John Benton, here in North Carolina, and it's a good bass fly. It's actually a good carp fly. It works just all over. I mean, it's just amazing. I'm really proud that I was able to name it for my daughter, and the success of it. It's been very gratifying. One of the things is to tell stories, and there's always really great stories. And one of the things that I thought I'd share a funny story with you about how embarrassed you can be. I did lots of banquets and talks and everything, and I was lucky enough to spend a lot of time in New Zealand, 30 years helping develop the New Zealand fly fishing lodge and guiding scene, and help them react and learn how to sell the New Zealand experience to the Americans that were coming over there. But I got to spend a lot of time in Australia, and boy, I picked up again a whole culture there based on trout fishing, and eventually, of course, on saltwater fishing. Much different than New Zealand. Lots of lakes, lots of spring creeks, lots of small streams. They don't lack the big rivers. They don't have the big rivers like New Zealand. But one of the things is that I found they had some really good fly shops, and I got hired to go over and help them Americanize their shop, because they were in Melbourne and Sydney and a lot of tourists coming through. And so I was in the shop with the owner, and he was back on the telephone. And in that day and age, this was in the late 70s, early 80s. Everybody went out for lunch, and there was hardly anybody came at the lunch hour. And so I'm in the shop, and and he's back on the telephone, and this really well-dressed man in a suit comes in, and geez, you just didn't see that coming into a fishing shop. And he was carrying a fly rod, and he came up to me and said, "As oh God, I'm just so getting old. Forgot the name of the owner. It'll come to me before this is over. I promise you." And he says, "No, he's back on the telephone." "Oh, he's always on the telephone." And he says, "Do you know anything about fly fishing?" And I said, "Yeah, I have a shop in the United States." "Oh, you're American." "Well, I've got a fly rod here, and I it doesn't have the line size on it, and I need to get a line to match it." I said, "Well, I can help you on that." And he said, he hands me the rod. It's a Thomas and Thomas Kane rod, and it's engraved in there. It's a gift from President Reagan. And I pull it out, and I said, "Well, I know this rod. I've seen it before. It takes a 5-weight line." And I look on it, and gift from Ronald Reagan. And I said, "Well, gosh, there were only a few of these made." And I said, "How did you get it?" He says, "I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm the Australia Prime Minister." And so anyway, we'd end up, Malcolm Fraser ended up doing some fishing together, and he tells this story at the World Fly Fishing Championship in front of about 1,000 people, and I'm going in the back, like, I asked him where his protection was. He said, "Nobody wants to kill me." He says, "They'll make somebody else president or prime minister, and they don't want that." And he says, "The bobbies are downstairs looking at the fishing tackle." So it was pretty interesting. I was really lucky in my life to be around a lot of people that enjoyed fly fishing and happened to have notoriety. And each one of them contributed in many different ways. One of the absolute fantastic trips I had was with Richard Pryor. Went fishing with him quite a few times after he had contracted multiple sclerosis, and he just loved fishing. And just what I found is that once you learn fly fishing, no matter who you are or you have a bondage with other people, and it's something that you share. And one of the things is you want to share that, maybe not your favorite fishing hole, but at least flies and ideas. And I think that's been the great part of my life. And one of the important things that I think is being involved with the One Fly over that we had our 35th anniversary with 1 year taken out for the pandemic. And we've raised over $20 million in that period to all going to stream research and to actually redoing streams and building landings, doing all kinds of wonderful things. And watched when it came to legislation, we could get a voice, and working a lot again with Trout Unlimited. But one of the great parts of my life was being a co-chairman of the Wild and Scenic bill called the Headwaters Bill, and it protected over 300 miles of the Snake River drainage. And to see the water managed and watch the fishing change, that has really been a big part of what I've done. And then I retired at 65 after starting the business when I was 19. And so I've been in another part of my life, which is really fun, because I went back to what I did in 1967 through about, the mid 70s, which was guide. And then all of a sudden I was being guided. I got to be with guides all around the world, which I learned an awful lot. And I can't tell you how much I learned in New Zealand. Just it was fantastic. But to fish many different places from South America to Africa to Europe, and coaching the U.S. fly fishing team was another really superb opportunity for me. So as I remember the old sketch on Saturday Night Live where the guy said, baseball has been very, very good to me. Well, I would say the same thing about fly fishing. I think there wasn't too many of us back in the 60s and 70s when we tried to make a difference. We tried to bring fly tying to everybody. Before, it was just a small sport which really favored people that had money. There wasn't a lot of guides. And one of the things I didn't talk about was the guiding. That really helped fly fishing. There's so many places that have guiding operations that weren't there. And the education through the guides have been one of the great things to help people that don't have the time to learn to fly fish and read books and do that. That was a shortcut and a very worthwhile because the guides became teachers. And I think that has been one of the really neat things. And of course, doing the books, we sold over 400,000 of the first volume and a couple 100,000 of book 2 and Time Flies with Jack Dennis and Friends. One of the questions was, how did videos get started? Well, it really kind of started with in the 70s, the late 70s. We started setting up cameras. They weren't really had got to the point where film was, let's say, developed yet, but you could hook a camera to a TV and do a live demonstration. And so the sport shows started doing that. And then we were involved when we got doing that, filming that. And I got involved with setting up theaters, but it really came from 3M, Owning Scientific Anglers. Gary Borger did the very first fly tying, and they started the series on videotape. And I got the idea in 1986. In fact, some of the footage you saw was from 1986. And I never saw a big market. And so I wanted to do it as inexpensively as possible and be satisfied with whatever it would bring back. But doing the live teaching and being able to film from behind the back, so I'm a predominant right-handers in the could actually see it rather than looking straight forward, which was easier to film. And so that was one of the things that we pioneered. But eventually, of course, it took off with and videos were able to be done and done cheaply. And the problem is a lot of them were done and they kind of never went into DVD because the sales just weren't there. So we've been able to restore a lot of them, and that's on my channel, JD's Wide World of Fly Fishing and Tying. I've restored some of the VHS that were lost and never brought into DVDs. So that's been another thing. And I think history is a roadmap to the future. Understanding where you came from will give you the vision or the map for the future. And I think that really ties into fly fishing. Now we're going into a very important fly for me because I saw a man by the name of Steve Ramirez from California, brilliant fly tyer, one of the really most talented fly tyers I've known. Not a very big known name to a lot of people, but he's a fly tyer. He tied a quill wing parachute, and he did it at one of the a quill wing divided parachute. And John Bailey grabbed me and said, "Man, you got to come over and see this." And I went over and see that. So that's perfect, but it's a light wing, and it's not going to be able to hold up nymphs and everything. He said, "Well, why don't you tie it in with calf tail or deer hair. And I said, well, I'll work on it, John. And that next summer, I was with Lee Wolf and Joan Wolf at their house, and we're looking over the beauty of his house on the Battenkill. And it was sitting there, and we were talking. I said, I got this idea for a fly, Lee. And he says, come on, you got to see. I was talking about the divided wing with the parachute. And he says, come down to my tying area. And here he was trying to put calf tail on a plastic body. He could get one of them to go down. So he had a parachute with a plastic setup. He was doing plastic flies in his 80s, trying to come up with new ideas for flies. But he couldn't get the divided wing. He said, I've been trying. And I said, look, I think I've got it. With the new light threads, I think I've got it. And so his urging, we went to work to devise a wolf. When he tied the wolf, it was tied to do hexagenas in big mayflies that were in the lakes in Ontario and Quebec, where Lee had lodges. And he felt the way he tied it, he said that it doesn't really imitate small dry flies. And of course, Dan Bailey really popularized the wolves. He put the calf tail where Lee used bucktail and really made the flies so well known. So at that point, we developed that fly, and I did a lot of it in New Zealand and worked really hard on getting the wings right and everything. But we found it was amazing because the way it laid in the water, it matched mayflies. You could actually tie and match most all of the mayfly hatches up to about a size 18, and I believe we can do it in 20. I'm working on Umpqua to do it in size 20s. But it's so important when it comes to fishing spinners and fishing really small flies, because you can tie the 18, which is small and looks like a blue wing olive, and yet you can put tricos behind it, you can put midges behind it, you can put smaller BWOs behind it, but also because of its design and its floatability, it can hold up nymphs, which gives it a terrific, good attractor mayfly pattern, and drifting nymphs and emergers under it, and it will hold it up. I should have. I was thinking I put one in it. I've actually done that when I've done tying demonstration. I put one at the start of the tying demonstration, floating, no floating on it. It'll sit there for the whole entire fly tying session. Then I pull it out and say, look at this. It's been one of Umpqua's best-selling flies, and if you haven't tied it, and it goes along with Mike Lawson's No Hackle, is one of the hardest flies to tie. And I can tell you, I use Umpqua flies, because especially in the size 18s, because they tie them better than I can tie them. So anyway, that's the next fly, and we'll come back after that and have a close. And I really think it's neat. I've heard a lot of nice comments, and I know everybody's wondering about what fly would you have for the one fly. Boy, that I urge everybody to write that. It's real easy. jh1fly.com. jh1fly.com. And you can see every one fly winner in beautiful color on the website. That's www.jh1fly. And it'll give you some ideas about how to craft your own one fly. I can tell you one thing. It's, once you look at it, some years it's nymphs, some years it's big dry, sometimes it's small flies. It all depends on the weather conditions and the river conditions. So there you go. So anyway, let's go on to one of my favorite flies, the Periwolf.
pale morning duns, one of our most prominent mayfly that occur throughout all over the country, and very much a part of our western fishing. And this is really a superb pattern because you're going to be able to see the wings, going to ride low in the water, very similar to Comparadun, except I think you're going to like even the way it floats a lot better. It will support having an emerger or a nymph underneath it, even in small sizes. We tie this down to size 20. I might say somebody ties it down to size 20. I let Umpqua tie them over in Thailand when it gets down to size 20, even 18s. Okay, so we've started out here with the elk hair. Now what I'm doing is I'm pulling out this, see all this junk that's in here? I'm running my finger through it. Now you can run a comb through that if you want. I've just been used to doing it this way for so long I don't use a comb, but combs can be good. Now this is, what I'm going to do is grabbing the ends and pulling it around. That's causing the smaller stuff to fall out. This is again what we call side posting. We use it a lot when we do calf tail. Again, moving it around. We're just about ready to try this. I always start with a lot more elk hair than what I think I'm going to end up with. Again, we use our gape. We'll see what happens after we stack it. Here we go in the stacker. Say the magic words. Harry Potter. I guess I'm not supposed to say Harry Potter. Maybe it's Trey. Now, you know what happened? It stuck in there, and that can happen a lot. And something you really should get some bounce and run. That's a fabric softener, and run it through your tools. I've been doing a lot of seminars, and boy, my the static electricity from this hair has really got to it. I opened it up, and it just boom, just stuck right there. So I gave it a shake, and it stayed there. Yeah, that looks better. Now let's look at it against our gape. Looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. Okay, now we're going to trim the butt ends. I always like to know, trim the butt ends, because then it can tell me whether it's slipped or not. I'm going to switch hands so it's going this direction with the tips to the front. Measure about the length of the shank. Now we're going to take our thread another halfway, and that's where our body's going to end right at that point, and a wing's going to go up, and we're going to have this area clear. So let's see if we can do that. Okay, we'll tie it in. Now this is a little tricky at first here. Now I'm going to switch scissors because this is the wrong scissor, because I've got to trim this hair really tight, and you'll see why. Because the problem with using elk hair on this fly and some of the other materials is it bulks up. Now one of the reasons we were able to tie this in small sizes was the ability for us to keep the thread from bulking up, and that's why we use that 8/0 Goodbroid, and that's a thread that just, it's absolutely critical in this fly. 8/0 Goodbroid, and it actually is about the size of about 10/0. They actually even make a 10/0, which, geez, I don't know what that's the size of, but it certainly isn't 10/0. This is, as you can see, just right here tying, it's really not bulking up. And that's what made this fly so hard to tie, is the bulkiness. And the reason I need these good scissors, this happens to be a titanium scissor, it's a new one, or tungsten. I said titanium, it's really tungsten. And you notice right now that I've got it in, I think, pretty good, and I've got to go to the front. One of the problems is you get too much hair, makes that body bigger too. Okay, now we're going to move our thread to the front and make sure that, oh, we're pretty good. We're right in that halfway point. We've got to have this room right here so that we tie our hackle off. Now we're going to go around the post. Now you're going to find this different than calf hair. I would recommend you tying the Adams or the Blue Wing Ollie first before you tackle this fly, because this is a lot trickier. I think if I would have tackled the elk first, this fly may not have come into existence. I think I would have torn my hair out, which little of it I have left, but I probably would have done some act of violence before I got this thing worked out. Lee was a little leery about the elk hair. You know, there were several wolf patterns made out of elk hair, but they were really Dan Bailey's invention. Lee did all the wolves basically with bucktail, of all things. Dan was the one that put in the calf tail. All right, now What I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that. I'm looking at this so that I want to be able to divide it. Now I'm going to get on the other side with my head. I'm going to run over here and look at it. I've been tying from here just so that I make sure that I got it divided equally. Now if it's too light on one side, it's not going to balance out right. So I really want to make sure that I get this right. I come back over, look at it, kind of spinning around, and make sure that I do have it right. Now what I'm doing is I'm running the thread in between them. I've built a post up down below here, as we did on the Blue Wing Olive. Now I'm going to wrap through it. Now once I feel that I've got this thing divided well enough, as you can see right here, well, then we'll post them. Now I'm going to tilt my vise. If you've got a vise that tilts, it really will help. And notice how this hair just, this thread just grips that hair. And that's why it's so wonderful. It's not slipping at all. I'm doing side posting on both sides. And we're now getting those wings to divide up. This is a problem because this will want to come together. That's why you have to make a lot of wraps and you need this lighter thread. I can guarantee you if you go down to a 12 or a 14 with something like uni thread and try to tie this fly, you will have a tough time and you will not be able to do it. You need this kind of thread. This reminds a lot of the old silk. Now, I would not use this thread for tying down any hair like an elk hair caddis or any of that type of thing. It just doesn't have the strength. But for this, what we're doing here, it works out great. Now, I'm going to move that around a little bit, and I think we're in pretty good shape. As you can see, the wings look great. What we formed is a Y. Y. The divided wing, and then a post, which we're going to wrap around, which is right there. And you don't need a lot of wraps of hackle on this fly. Now you notice I've got a pretty good body built up just with the thread, and it's nice and tapered. So you've got to be very, very sparse. Now what I tend to do is not use, the Arizona Crystal Rabbit, but I use superfine. Superfine is very fine right here, as you can see. It's just like its name. It's a polypropylene. And it sounds like clothing, polypropylene. Poly thread, I guess is the proper term. Floats really nicely. And I've got a pale watery dun. It's really a pale yellow. And we're going to then add the infamous rainbow thread, which I know I've dropped things a lot. We need something on our laps that just everything sticks to. Okay, one strand's all we need. Now you might ask, what's the value of running a strand through here? But I'll tell you, I've had great luck with it. People always are commenting how it looks so nice. And I know when we experimented with this fly in New Zealand, and I got to get some wax here, get it over there. And the guides in New Zealand all insisted on having the rainbow thread woven through it when they experimented. Before we brought it out in Umpqua, we had 3 seasons. We wanted 3 complete seasons of using it with our guides before we knew it was be a pattern. Now, very sparse. I can't tell you. I've actually put it on more. I'm doing too much talking, and I know you're listening to me, and I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. And I've got this in my right hand, and there we go. It's got to be very sparse. That's actually heavier than I would have liked to have had. Now, as we move up here, got a little piece of black, I don't know, whatever it was, it stuck to it. Bad thing about wax, everything sticks to it, including deer hair if you have any left on your bench. That's actually pretty good. There it is, a piece of marabou or something. There we go. And now we're going to go to the front and do the same thing. Now be very careful that you don't dub this right up to the post and cover the post up. Then you will have a tough time wrapping your hackle. Now, at this point, we've got to make sure that this is built up right there. Right there is important. That has to have a nice build-up area. It would, of course, be our thorax. Really a thorax-type fly where the thorax is very prominent. And now, this is a little heavier than I would have liked. I think that I could have worked at it. It could have probably had to have been a little sparser, but it will certainly work. But I always judge every fly and try to do better on it. I've never tied the perfect fly, guarantee you. Always something I find wrong with it, and that's why we keep working on that. Okay, now we're going to put on even 18s. I saw some the other day that were 20s. I mean, it's just amazing what we can get with saddles. Now, I'm going to use a dark dun, or light dun, excuse me. I use the dark dun on the Blue Wing Always, light dun on the pale morning duns. It's almost even a cream. Some people will use cream. And I don't think it really makes that much difference. All the Hackle's going to do is support the fly. Now, we're going to tie it in so that the vein, the glossy side is up, is a part of that wing is right closest to us. And you can actually see it sticking out right there. There it is. I'm going to trim it off. There we go. So let's take a look at this here. Let's tilt it a little bit and you can see it. It's right tied in there. There's the base right there. Now, again, the thread is in front. We're going to go back around and tie this fly again. For the sake of time, I'm not going to put any cement in there, but I would definitely drop a little cement. Again, this thing is going to, you can see it's holding pretty good. So if you catch a fish, just remember, push your fingers down before you tie it again. When you tie it back, dry it out and put your floating on it. Okay, now I've gone around the wing. Now, you don't really need to put, when you get in these smaller sizes like this one, you don't need to put a lot of hackle on it. Let's go back and take a look at what we did and just see how many wraps of hackle should we need. Well, 1, 2, and 3 would probably be fine if we wanted to. Okay, I just have so much fun wrapping this parachutes. Again, wrapping it towards us. We're going to switch our hands, go down underneath it. Now I'm locking it. Really have it in there and go back around. We've seen that a couple times already. And there is our little PMD. Now don't worry about it, that there's 2 or 3 more times on the tape we're going to doing parachutes, and I'll be going over that again and again. It's something I get asked a lot about, the way I wrap parachutes. Now we're going to go in here and trim off a little of the, you can't help with a parachute. I don't care how good you are, keeping all that hackle out of the way. What you don't want is to tie that vein along the body, because it ends up right down here in the eye, especially on cripple patterns. So keep an eye on that. I'm going to tie it right off, and there's our PMD Periwolf.
I'm back. As you can see, it does take a little bit of skill. You'll find that using calf tail for the bigger sizes and calf body hair for the smaller sizes will be much easier to try on first. The elk is tricky, and but it's still wonderful fly, and I think that you will enjoy using it, and you'll probably end up like me, buying them from Umpqua. Anyway, I want to mention that the videos that we've done today will be available on the Umpqua page on YouTube, and there'll be other patterns that I've done, the longer versions on my own YouTube channel, Jack Dennis's, well, not Jack Dennis, JD. Everybody that knows me calls me JD, so I'm doing the JD's Wide World of Fly Fishing and Tying. So anyway, the Tyer stream on the Umpqua page, and we're starting to wrap up. I've spent as much time with you as a regular movie, and I hope that you'll go right to sleep after this is over with if you haven't gone before this. There's just all kinds of wonderful stories in fly fishing, and I also want to mention, before I do the story, that next week's live stream is on Wednesday, not Thursday, with Charlie Craven, one of the great, I would say, young tyers, and you would say, wait a minute, he's over 50, but I'm 75, so that he's young to me. my son just turns 50 this year. This is a year of 50 years of marriage, 50 years of Umpqua, 50 years of the book. I don't know, there's got to be some 50 years more there somewhere. But anyway, I think when I look back on the flies, and it's something about when I pick up a fly, there's memories in it. I can pick up a fly. I've got boxes of flies that I've kept over the years, and I pick up this fly and I say, this is a great memory. I can think about the time I used it, who I was with, and one of the great experiences to relive. And that's what fly tying is. And you know what I tell anybody, how to get better at a sport is to take a fly tying course. Say you don't, well, I don't have the time to tie flies. So what? Take the course and learn how the flies are tied and what the reasons are for that. You'll meet a lot of great people. You'll find some fishing mates, but take a course from your local shop or your local fly casting club, because it'll teach you how to buy flies and what you really need. It's one of the most important parts of fly fishing is learning to tie flies, not to tie your flies. You may decide, hey, I want to tie all of them. That's great. But it'll make you a better fly fisherman. And one of the things that I always like to tell people is how important casting is. The presentation of a fly. One of the things that Gary studied very much, Gary LaFontaine, is how insects drift and how trash in the stream drifts, how a fish can pick out an insect with all the I hate to use words rubbish, but all the plant life and sticks and gravel and everything going down. But it's because it floats a certain way. And that is what your fly has to imitate. So it doesn't look like just another piece of trash. That's why some people, I'll never figure out, and this is a really, really good story. And it's kind of one that I got a couple. I'll give you a couple here to end the program. We were doing, Phil Rowley and Brian Chan and I were all doing this a series of fly tying tapes and fly fishing, introduction to fly fishing lakes with their great experience. And they all got real particular. And one of the things about you, one thing you don't want to see, you don't want to see a hot dog made, you don't want to see a bill in Congress made, and you don't want to see a fly fishing video made. But we had a tough time telling Brian that we just need, if you talk about fishing the fly and catching the fly, we need to catch a fish, but it doesn't necessarily have to be on that fly. You know, we can cut in the fly close-ups and everything. Oh, no, it's got to be caught on the fly. I won't do it any other way. Well, that just increased the cost of the video, more time spent. So he's known as the king of the chironomid. And so there was another guy that was guiding on this lake that we were filming. It's a beautiful private spring-fed lake. And he had been coming up there with this Canadian guide for years. And I was talking to the guy. He says, well, you know who that is? And he said, this is his last fishing trip. He's only got a couple of months to live. And he was in his late 80s or 90s. He says, that's the man who is one of the founders of MASH in Korea. And he's the only doctor that won a Medal of Honor. Is he picked up, when it was overran by the North Koreans, he picked up a machine gun and mowed them down and saved the hospital. He says he's a very special guy. And I was looking at him casting, and it was painful. And Brian's looking at him, and Brian's trying to get this fish on a chironomid, and we're filming. And every time we turned around, this guy had a fish on. He had a fish on, and my cameraman's going, I need to go over there and get some pictures. So he went over there, and Brian's going, he's doing everything wrong. He's not making anything, and he's catching fish. Well, then I told him the story about who he was, and he goes, I don't understand. Phil says, his being a doctor of entomology and very thing, he didn't understand that some things you can't explain. This guy was special, and he was getting rewarded. Even though he was doing everything wrong, he was catching all the fish. That's fishing. And I think, and I'll leave you with the last story. It's Mike might have told this story. I don't know if he did, but it's one of the great stories of all times. And Mike, in my opinion, is one of the greatest storytellers there are. So this was in the early days of Henry Fork, when Ernie Schwiebert and Andy Puyons and Doug Swisher and all the great tyers from that era would come to the Henry Fork to fish the great green drake hatch. And they had come in, and Mike in his early shop had it's June and it's cold, and he's got a fire going, and everybody's having their whiskeys and everything by the fire and talking about how poor the fishing is. And in walked this guy with a caterpillar cat hat on, dressed in jeans, and goes over to the fly bin, starts looking through the flies. And everybody says, wait a minute, I saw that guy on Bonefish Flats. Every time I turned around, he had a fish on. And he goes, we need to kind of get the information. Who wants to go talk to him? Well, Andy Puyons had this pipe and the tweed hat and the beard. I mean, he was just perfect. I'll go do that. He walks over there and says, yes, my good man, may I ask you, were you out fishing Bonefish Flats? He says, I don't know. I was on the Henry Fork. Where I was. He says, well, I saw you out fishing. And what were you using? Were you using ephemerellas or a Baetis parvus? And he goes on with all these Latin names. And the guy looks at him and says, I don't know. I was just using this little black sucker. Now it wasn't exactly what he said, but this is a family program and you can put it in. In other words, sometimes you just need a little black sucker. And with that, I'll leave the last story with Lee Wolf. We're sitting there, and Lee said, would you like to go? He's coming to the One Fly. This is the 4th year. And he said, look, I appreciate coming to One Fly. I'm really excited about it. And he said, see that plane down there? He said, I haven't flown it in 5 years. He says, I would like to take you to Quebec and show you my camps. And I know you can fly. And between the two of us, we could make it. And it was a Piper Cub, and sitting there, and it was just a beautiful evening. And in comes Joan with a bunch of strawberries and sour cream, and dipping it in white wine. It was just perfect. And he looked at the plane, he looked at Joan, he looked at me. He says, the greatest things in life begin with F. And I go, really? He says, yep, flying, fishing, food, and you can guess what the other one is. And Joan just slapped him with the towel and said, quit it, Lee. And he goes, ha, 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 ha. And anyway, that was, we actually planned the trip. And unfortunately, he passed away getting his license renewed so we could make the trip. He had a heart attack after he had passed the test landing, and we never got to go on the trip. But I'm really blessed with his most favorite Royal Humpty tide that he gave me, and that to Joan after his death. And so I feel like I've been handed a great gift with that special fly. And I have a bronze that he did of the Atlantic salmon. It was one of the great friendships that I had in my life. Anyway, I'd like to thank all of you and Umpqua for this chance for a 75-year-old to rattle on and on and on and on. And I hope that our paths cross, and look forward to the next time I can be with you. And come visit us on my channel. I've got a lot of old historic video from the early days in New Zealand to early days fishing around Wyoming, and some of the great historic presentations of people that are no longer with us, like Gary LaFontaine. Again, thanks very much. I thank our host, Russell Miller, who's sending me these nice little notes and kept me to know which order the flies are. So thank you very much, and keep right on a casting.